It was a crisp autumn morning when Francesca set off, the roar of her motorcycle engines reverberating against the quiet suburban streets of Pennsylvania. I watched her drive away, that last glimpse of her red BMW touring bike disappearing around the corner. Her promise echoed in my mind. I'll call every night, Mom. No matter what. You don't have to worry. But now, as I stood at the window, the sun dipping lower in the sky, that promise felt more like a fleeting memory. The first day wasn't so bad. I had tried to convince myself that it was just a spotty signal, that she was out there, in the vast emptiness of the Rockies, the kind of place you couldn't rely on a cell phone. A remote campsite or a dead zone, I thought. She'd call when she could, but by the second day, a shift settled in my stomach, and I found myself checking the clock every few minutes. She hadn't called. Not a text. Not a missed call. Mark was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, but even he couldn't hide the unease in his eyes. He didn't say it out loud, but we both knew something felt wrong. Maybe she's just distracted, Mark said, trying to calm my rising anxiety. But there was no denying the crack in his voice, the subtle tremble as he reached for his coffee cup. The silence was too long. It wasn't like Francesca. She was the kind of daughter who always kept her word. The kind who checked in, no matter where she was. I picked up the phone again, but her number just rang and rang. I felt my heart beat faster, a panic starting to creep in. I'll try again, I said, more to myself than to Mark, but no answer. No call. No text. And then, a wave of cold dread. Mark turned off the TV, his face unreadable as he watched me check the phone once more. The second day came and went, and still nothing. I tried not to show it, but inside, I could feel the fear settling deeper, curling its way into my chest. She's not answering, I whispered, as though saying it aloud might make it real. Mark didn't speak, but his jaw tightened, the worry in his eyes speaking volumes. I could see his mind working, trying to piece together any logical explanation. He knew Francesca was independent, that she was capable, but this was different. We both knew it. I walked over to the window again, staring out at the empty street, my hands clutching the cold glass. Mark came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist, but even his touch couldn't erase the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. Maybe she's fine, he said, but his voice was uncertain, like he was trying to convince himself. More than me. She's probably just enjoying her trip. But I knew better. This wasn't like her. And every moment without an update only deepened the sinking feeling in my gut.by. The third day, I couldn't sit still anymore. I paced the house, checking the time, hoping for a sign, a message, something. But nothing came. No call. No text. Just silence, like a cold, suffocating weight hanging over the house. It was time to make the call. Mark's face was a mask of concern as I dialed the sheriff's office. The phone rang once, twice. My heart pounded, each second stretching longer than the last. When the dispatcher picked up, her voice was calm, almost too calm, as I explained who I was, who Francesca was, and what had happened. Or, more accurately, what hadn't happened. I understand, the dispatcher said, her voice professional. We'll start looking into it right away. I hung up the phone, feeling the weight of those words settle heavily in my chest. Mark stood next to me, his hand resting on my shoulder, but we both knew what we were facing now. It wasn't just a missed call, something was terribly wrong. I stared at the phone in my hand, the silent screen a reminder of everything that was slipping away. Our daughter, out there in the world, her fate now uncertain, and all we had was the sound of the dial tone ringing in our ears. Mark didn't say anything for a long moment. He didn't have to. We both knew the truth now. This isn't like her, I finally whispered, the realization washing over me. I closed my eyes for a brief second, trying to calm the storm inside me, but it was no use. My daughter, who had always been so reliable, so strong, was out there, and I couldn't reach her. I turned to Mark, my voice barely a whisper. What if something's happened? Mark didn't answer right away. His eyes, filled with his own fears, locked onto mine, and in that moment, we both understood the magnitude of what was to come. The sheriff's office was already mobilizing. The search would begin. But the question that gnawed at me, the one I couldn't shake, where was Francesca? And why hadn't she called? The silence in our house was deafening. And now, it felt like the quiet before a storm. The call came in, shattering the fragile calm we had tried to hold onto. Detective David Miller stood in the heart of the small sheriff's office, his face weathered by years of experience in these mountains. His eyes, though tired, never wavered as he listened to the details of Francesca Sullivan's disappearance. A solo motorcycle trip, a missing young woman, a family desperate for answers. The San Juan Mountains were beautiful, rugged, dangerous, but they were also vast, stretching for miles upon miles. A maze of jagged peaks, dense forests, and hidden valleys where people, even experienced travelers, could vanish without a trace. Miller had handled missing person cases before, but something about this one felt different. Francesca wasn't just another hiker lost on a trail. She was a young woman with a plan, a clear route, and a promise to her parents. And now, there was only silence. The sheriff's office had already begun gathering a timeline from Francesca's family. The last known contact, a simple selfie sent to her mother, was the only clue they had. A digital pin dropped on a map, pointing to the San Juan Mountains, but that was it. The days were ticking by, and no one had seen her. No one had heard from her. And the mountains? They were swallowing her up whole. The search teams worked tirelessly, splitting up into small groups and fanning out across the rugged terrain. They climbed the steepest paths, navigated through dense underbrush, and scoured every rocky pass, but with each passing hour, the sense of hopelessness grew. The forests, with their towering pines and aspen trees, offered no mercy. The rocky passes, steep and unforgiving, stretched into the distance like a vast maze. The land was beautiful, but it could also be deadly. Miller stood at the edge of one of the cliffs, his eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows over the land. His mind raced, piecing together the details. Where was she? What happened? The search continued into the night. The small, flickering lights of the search party moved like fireflies through the vast, unyielding wilderness. But despite their efforts, no sign of Francesca. No bike. No footprints. Not even a broken branch or a tire mark. The exhaustion began to set in. Day after day passed, and still, nothing. The constant effort, the mounting pressure, it was taking its toll on everyone involved. But just as hope seemed to fade completely, Miller received a call that would change everything. It was from Francesca's mother, Eleanor. She sounded desperate. Her voice cracked as she told him about the selfie. David, I'm not sure how to explain this, but I think it might be the key. Her last picture. It's not just a picture. There's something in the background. A place she was. Just before the silence. Miller listened closely, his pulse quickening. Ella's words seemed to echo in his mind. A place she was. That photo. It held the answers. He ordered his team to halt the search for the day. As the sun began to set, Miller sat down at his desk, pulling up the photo. There she was, smiling. A wide grin spread across her face, eyes bright under the mountain sun. Her blue jacket clung to her frame, and her red BMW sport touring bike sat proudly behind her, bags packed high for the adventure ahead. The turquoise lake, the jagged peaks, they were all there, but it wasn't just the beauty of the landscape that caught his eye. It was the small detail in the background. A landmark. An area. His heart sank as he zoomed in on the image. The location wasn't just a random stop. It was a place he recognized, that lake, that mountain range. It was a remote corner of the San Juans, a spot few people ventured to. The kind of place hidden from sight, even from the search teams who had combed the area. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Francesca wasn't lost. Not in the way they thought. She had been here, at this exact spot, just before everything went dark. The photo wasn't just a memory. It was a clue, a guide to the very place where they might find her. Miller looked at the photo again. He could almost feel the weight of it. This picture wasn't just a fleeting moment of happiness. It was a trace, a connection. And now, search had a new focus. The mountains, the vast, wild, unforgiving land, seemed less like a maze now. They had a direction, a point of reference. The landscape was no longer just an empty stretch of wilderness. It was the key. With a deep breath, Miller stood up, a new fire burning in his chest. Get the team ready, he said, his voice low but steady. We are going to that spot. The mystery was far from over. It had only just begun. The days turned into weeks, but the mountains never gave up their secrets. The search teams moved relentlessly through the rugged terrain, their efforts as tireless as they were futile. Every day, more ground was covered, Every trail, every rocky outcrop, every dense forest scanned, but the result was always the same. Nothing. The vastness of the San Juans was overwhelming. Even the most seasoned searchers were beginning to feel the weight of its emptiness. It was a place that swallowed people whole, and no one had any idea where to look next. I could feel the frustration building within Detective Miller as he reviewed the search reports. The aerial scans, once so full of promise, had drawn a blank. The ground patrols, methodical and exhaustive, had yielded no new clues. No sign of Francesca. No motorcycle. Not even a footprint. The sky, always wide and endless, over Colorado, felt like a heavy, oppressive weight now. Every time the search teams returned to base with no news, the silence grew louder. And as the days dragged on, that familiar feeling of dread, of waiting for something that might never come, began to eat away at the hearts of everyone involved. Miller stood over the map in the sheriff's office late one evening, his finger tracing the routes where Francesca might have traveled. The roads, the turns, the forests, all of it seemed to blend together into a meaningless maze. He could almost feel the land mocking him, daring him to find her, knowing it wasn't going to be that easy. The phone rang, pulling him back from his thoughts. "It's her parents," the dispatcher said, and Miller could hear the tremor in her voice. "They want an update." He could hear the pain in Mark Sullivan's voice as soon as the phone connected. "David, what's happening? You're saying you've searched everywhere. You're saying there's nothing left. Are we really going to believe our daughter just vanished? Is that it?" Mark's voice cracked as he spoke, and for a moment, Miller couldn't find the words to answer. He could hear the same panic, the same uncertainty that had been gnawing at him for days. "I promise we are doing everything we can," Miller replied, though even he didn't believe the words anymore. "We've covered the ground, we've done the aerial searches, but we are just not finding anything. I'll keep you updated as soon as we have more." He hung up, running his fingers through his hair. The case was starting to feel like it was slipping through his fingers, and the more he thought about it, the less he believed the story of a simple accident. It didn't make sense. Francesca had been too careful, too methodical. She wouldn't just disappear, not without a trace, not without leaving some clue behind. As the days passed, Miller began to entertain a darker thought. What if this wasn't an accident? What if she had been taken? The theory gnawed at him. It didn't sit right, but it felt like the only explanation that fit. He couldn't help but imagine someone watching her. Someone who had planned this. But who? Why? The more he pondered, the more the unanswered questions ate away at him. And as the tension continued to build, it began to spill over onto the Sullivan family. Mark and Eleanor's grief began to shift into something else, something more dangerous. Their frustration turned inward, pushing them further apart. Every moment that passed without answers felt like an unbearable weight. They'd been holding on to hope for too long. But then, just as it seemed like the trail would turn cold forever, a breakthrough came. It was a small thing, something insignificant. At first, a motel owner, a man in his mid-50s with a thick accent, had seen something, a conversation at a local gas station just days before Francesca went missing. The man recalled a tall, lanky figure, a man who had approached Francesca while she was filling up her motorcycle. He seemed to take more than a passing interest in her, asking too many questions. "Where are you headed? Are you traveling alone? That's a nice bike you've got there." It wasn't much, but it was enough. The strange encounter echoed in Miller's mind. He had always believed in the possibility of foul play, but this was the first real lead that pointed to a person. Miller leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together. This wasn't just a missing person case. This was something more. "Get me that security footage," he said, his voice quiet but full of purpose. The motel owner had no idea who the man was, but the description was clear enough. With the new lead, Miller wasted no time. The next morning, the search efforts were retooled, the focus shifting from the terrain to the people in it. He sent a deputy to the gas station to collect the security footage and begin asking questions. Could this man be the key? Miller didn't know yet. But as he looked over the case file again, something inside him shifted. He was no longer chasing ghosts in the mountains. Now, he was hunting a person. A human element had entered the picture. For the first time in days, he felt the faintest stir of hope, but that hope was fragile. Because if someone had taken Francesca, if they were hiding in plain sight, it meant the worst was still to come. The Hunt was far from over, and now, Miller was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. No matter where it led, Miller sat in his cramped office, the glow of the computer screen casting sharp shadows over his tired face. The case had been haunting him for days now, and each new lead seemed to dissolve into nothing. But this? This could be different. The motel owner's description of the man at the gas station was a small thread, but it was a thread nonetheless. Miller could feel the weight of it in his gut. This might be the breakthrough they needed. He pressed play on the security footage, his eyes narrowing as the grainy image filled the screen. The footage was blurry, but the man was unmistakable. Tall, lanky, with a worn-out baseball cap and an old pair of work boots. He lingered by the gas pump, not in a hurry, not in any particular rush, but just watching, and then Francesca came into view. She pulled up to the pump, her red BMW motorcycle gleaming in the sunlight. Miller could see the bright smile on her face as she began to fill up, completely unaware of the man who was eyeing her every move. The man approached her slowly, his steps measured. He didn't greet her like a normal passerby, or even someone just admiring her bike. No, this was different. He lingered too long. His questions were too pointed. He leaned in, just a bit too close. "Where are you headed?" he asked. His voice, muffled through the static of the video, sounded odd, unsettling. "You traveling alone? That's a nice bike you've got there. Where you from?" Francesca looked slightly uncomfortable, but polite, smiling as she answered him, keeping her distance. But the man didn't back off. He kept pressing her for more details that felt too personal for a stranger to ask. "You're on your own. What's your destination? You sure you're safe out here, especially on a bike like that?" Miller felt his stomach twist. Something wasn't right. This man's persistence raised red flags, and he could see Francesca's body language shift. The smile faded just slightly, the way she shifted her weight, the way her eyes darted to the exit as if considering whether to leave. She eventually finished filling up, gave the man one last polite nod, and drove off. The camera followed her. Until the red bike disappeared from view, the man standing there, staring at the empty space where she had been, Miller leaned back in his chair, watching the footage again, then again. He felt the knot in his stomach tighten. This wasn't just some friendly passerby. This man had been far too focused on Francesca. Too interested. And now, she was gone. He quickly pulled up his notes, dialing the motel owner's number. "Hi, this is Detective Miller," he said, his voice steady. "We need to follow up on that lead you gave me. The man who spoke to Francesca at the gas station. I need to know everything you can about him." Minutes later, he was on his way to a small town a few hours outside of Lake City, chasing down this new lead. The man's description had led him to a transient worker, a man who drifted through towns, picking up odd jobs when he needed money. Miller didn't expect much, but it was a lead. It was something. The man's name was Robert Larkin. Miller found him working on a ranch, covered in dust and sweat, his hands rough from years of labor. He looked harmless enough, a simple guy, trying to make a living. But his face changed when Miller showed him the still from the security footage. He looked confused, almost startled. "I don't know her," Robert said quickly, shifting uncomfortably. "I've never seen her before." Miller studied him closely. The lie was thin, too thin. But there was something else, a tremor in his voice. Miller wasn't convinced, not yet. "Tell me about that day," Miller pressed, his voice calm, but firm. "You were at the gas station. You approached her. Why?" Robert looked away, scratching the back of his neck. He hesitated, his eyes darting to the side like he was searching for an escape. I didn't mean no harm. I was just admiring the bike. I've always wanted one like that." Miller could see the crack in the story. It didn't add up. But when he checked Robert's alibi, it seemed like a dead end. The ranch owner confirmed Robert had been working all day, away from the gas station. On the day Francesca went missing, Miller rubbed his temples, frustration mounting. The promising lead had fizzled out, just like so many before it. The man was cleared. No evidence, no proof of anything. The case had circled back to where it started. Miller's thoughts turned back to Francesca's family. Every day, the grief in their voices was becoming harder to bear. Mark and Eleanor, hanging on by a thread, desperate for answers. The weight of their pain, their unanswered questions, felt unbearable. But then, something caught his eye as he returned to his office, an old map of the area, pinned to the wall. He stared at it, mind racing. His fingers moved instinctively, tracing the roads, the towns, the landmarks. And then, a connection clicked in his mind. Robert had mentioned the gas station in passing, but what stood out now was a small, isolated town on the map, a place he hadn't considered before. The same town Robert had mentioned when he talked about his travels. And that town. It was near the very spot where Francesca had last been seen, just a few miles away from where her last photo had been taken. Miller's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. Francesca hadn't just disappeared. She'd been targeted. And Robert Larkin, he was connected to this place. He was connected to her disappearance. This wasn't just a random encounter. It was something more. And the deeper Miller dug, the darker this story became. He stood up, determination flickering in his chest. The investigation was heading into uncharted waters now. He wasn't just chasing leads anymore. He was chasing a person who knew too much. And he was going to find them. He grabbed his jacket and turned to the door. The search was far from over. It was only just beginning. The days turned into weeks. And then those weeks slipped into months. The phone calls stopped. The search teams were gone, scattered, their efforts slowly fading into the back of Miller's mind. Mark and Eleanor, despite their promises to stay strong, were starting to crack. The hope that had kept them going, faint and fragile, was beginning to wither day by day. The case was cold. Too cold. And every night, when the silence hung in the air, they found themselves asking the same question over and over. Where was their daughter? "I can't just sit here anymore," Mark had said one night, his voice low and tight with emotion. "We need to go back. We need to search ourselves." Eleanor hadn't been sure. She was tired, exhausted, really. She wanted to believe that. The authorities were doing everything they could. But the months had chipped away at her resolve. She could feel the hope slipping through her fingers, like water in the desert. But Mark was insistent. There was nothing left but to go, to try again. Even if they didn't know where to look. So, they packed their bags and drove back to Colorado. The drive was long, the endless stretch of highway a grim reminder of the mountains. Ahead, the very same mountains where Francesca had disappeared, and where every passing moment only deepened the silence. The roads were the same. The trees, the hills, they all looked familiar, but now they felt like strangers. The scenery that once held so much promise now felt suffocating. They drove through the winding paths Francesca had taken, stopping at every gas station, at every rest stop, trying to speak to locals, but each interaction felt colder than the last. The faces were indifferent. The small towns didn't care about their pain. To the people here, Francesca was just another face in the crowd, another missing person. She didn't matter. Mark pushed on, calling every number, following every lead he could find on the internet. He spent hours sifting through forums, reading posts from strangers who might hold the key to their daughter's disappearance. Some of them were well-meaning, but many of them were no better than ghosts, just people hiding behind screens, offering empty speculation. As Eleanor sat beside him, her mind wandered. She could see the exhaustion on Mark's face, the same weariness that tugged at her own heart. She could feel the coldness of the world around them, the weight of their unanswered questions. But there was nothing she could do but sit in the passenger seat, her hands tightly gripping the handle. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of a small, remote town, hours away from the nearest city, that something strange happened. They had stopped at an old diner, hoping for a warm meal, a brief respite. It was one of those places that looked like it had been stuck in time, peeling paint on the walls, faded photographs on the counter, and the scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. It wasn't much, but it was a brief moment of normalcy. Mark was asking the waitress about any recent travelers. He leaned in close, his voice strained. "Have you seen anyone like my daughter? A young woman on a red motorcycle." He showed her a photo of Francesca, the one that had been sent to Eleanor. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes, paused. She glanced at the photo, then slowly shook her head. "Can't say I've seen her. Sorry." But then, something caught Eleanor's eye. A woman at the back of the diner, hunched over a table, seemed to be staring at them. Her eyes met Eleanor's for just a moment before she quickly looked away. There was something in her gaze, something familiar, but at the same time, unsettling. Eleanor's heart skipped. For a brief second, she thought she saw Francesca. But when she looked again, the woman had already turned her head, her face hidden beneath the brim of a worn-out hat. "Mark," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "Look at that woman." Mark turned, but by the time he did, the woman had already left the diner, slipping out the door without a word. She looked like her, Eleanor said, a hint of desperation creeping into her voice. Maybe it's her. Maybe. We've found her. Mark jumped up from the table, his heart racing. They both rushed outside, their eyes scanning the empty street. But the woman was gone. Vanished. They stood in the street for a moment, the cold air biting at their skin, as the truth began to sink in. That woman hadn't been Francesca. She couldn't have been. But the resemblance was uncanny. They returned to their car in silence, the reality of the situation weighing heavily on their shoulders. They'd chased a ghost. A fleeting hope had dissolved in an instant, just like every other lead they'd followed. And now, the silence felt louder than ever. Mark slid behind the wheel, his face drawn and tired. "We are not giving up," he muttered, more to himself than to Eleanor. But the words were hollow. The months had passed. The case had grown cold, and every new lead only seemed to bring them further away from the truth. And now, standing on the edge of another dead end, they realized they had no idea where to go next. They were running out of time. Out of hope, as they drove back toward the mountains, the weight of the world seemed to press down on them. Francesca was out there, somewhere, but the search had become a maze with no end in sight. The pain of not knowing was becoming too much to bear, but even as their resolve began to crack, a chilling thought crept into Mark's mind. The woman at the diner had seemed so much like Francesca. Could it be possible? Was there still hope? Or was this just another dead end, another empty space where answers should have been? He didn't know, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The phone call came out of nowhere, but it was everything we had been waiting for. Mark was pacing, the phone pressed to his ear, and his eyes darting around the room. I could hear the words before he even spoke them, a familiar sense of hope quickly fading into disbelief. "It's her, Eleanor." "It's her," Mark whispered, voice shaking. A tourist saw a woman at a diner in Arizona. She looked just like Francesca. They said the resemblance was uncanny. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It was as if time had slowed down. And for a moment, I dared to believe. We had spent so many months chasing shadows, but this felt different. Maybe, just maybe, the pieces were finally falling into place. Mark dropped the phone and hurried to grab the keys. "We need to go. Now." We packed quickly, our movements frantic, driven by the fragile thread of hope that now hung before us. The air in the car felt heavier with each passing mile, thick with anticipation. Arizona seemed so far, yet so close at the same time, but when we reached the diner, that fleeting hope began to fray. The woman, the waitress who might have been Francesca, looked nothing like her. At first, she seemed familiar, her eyes, her posture, but when she turned to face us, the truth hit like a tidal wave. The woman was a stranger, nothing more. "She's not her, Mark," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Mark didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at the waitress for what felt like an eternity. The sight of her had been enough to reignite everything: hope, fear, and grief, but now it was gone, snuffed out in an instant. A momentary spark that burned bright, and then vanished into the dark. "I thought," Mark trailed off, his voice cracking. "I thought it was her." I could feel the weight of the disappointment settle in my chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. We had come so far, only to be met with nothing. Again, the drive back was quiet, the familiar hum of the engine doing little to calm the storm inside me. We'd been looking for Francesca for months, driven by the belief that we would find her. But with every dead end, with every disappointment, the light at the end of the tunnel grew dimmer. We returned home, defeated. But as the days passed, the quiet misery of our life started to feel like it might be the new normal. That was until the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't the usual frustrating call. It was from Detective Reyes, the new investigator who had taken over after Miller retired. His voice, steady yet tense, cut through the silence. "Mark, Eleanor, I need to talk to you about something. It's big. Really big." My heart skipped. Again, a flicker of that same hope stirring once more. "What is it?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "We found something," Reyes said, his words weighted with urgency. "A motorcycle. In a river. In New Mexico. It's Francesca's." I felt my breath catch in my throat. I wasn't prepared for this. A motorcycle, miles away from where we last knew she was, had been discovered. In a river, are you sure? Mark asked, his voice shaking. Yes. We are certain. The VIN matches Francesca's bike. I turned to look at Mark, his face pale. The silence between us felt suffocating as we tried to process what this meant. It was her bike. It had to be, but the river, New Mexico, it was all so far from where we had been searching. How had it ended up there? Reyes's next words hit like a punch. We are reclassifying this case. We can't ignore it anymore. It's no longer just a missing person case. It's a homicide. The word echoed in my ears, but it didn't feel real. Homicide. The weight of it settled deep in my chest, suffocating me, making it harder to breathe. Francesca was gone, yes. But the idea that someone had done this to her, that someone had taken her life, was too much to bear. I didn't want to accept it. I couldn't. Mark's hand tightened around mine. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. We both understood. The gravity of what Reyes had said. The case had shifted. It wasn't just a search anymore. It was a fight for justice. And it was personal now. Are you going to find the person who did this? Mark asked, his voice filled with quiet desperation. We are doing everything we can, Reyes replied. We'll keep you updated. The call ended, and the weight of it all hit us. The relief of knowing her bike had been found was overshadowed by the unbearable truth. Francesca had been taken from us. And now we had to find out who did it, why, and how. The days ahead were uncertain, but one thing was clear. The investigation was no longer just a search for answers. It was a pursuit of justice. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope in the darkness, but it was a dangerous hope. The closer we got to the truth, the more the darkness threatened to consume us. The helicopter hovered above the Rio Grande Gorge, its blades whipping the air into a frenzy. Below, the water churned violently, carrying debris from the flood that had reshaped the riverbed. It was a scene of chaos, a natural force that had torn through the land, leaving only destruction in its wake. But there, among the twisted trees and rocks, something caught the eye of the search team. A flash of red, submerged in the murky water. The helicopter's descent was slow, deliberate, and precise as the team prepared for the recovery. Below, a diver readied himself, securing the cables to his harness, his face hidden behind the cold glass of his mask. The job was dangerous, but it wasn't the first time they'd retrieved something from the river. The difference this time was that the object wasn't just a discarded piece of trash or a fallen tree. It was a motorcycle. Francesca's motorcycle. The team worked methodically, pulling the bike from the river, every inch of it covered in mud and grime, the red paint, almost unrecognizable beneath layers of dirt. It was clear that it hadn't been there for 6 years, not like they'd originally thought. The rust was only surface deep, not nearly enough to account for the years of exposure it should have endured. Get it to the lab, Detective Reyes muttered under his breath as the bike was hoisted up into the air. His mind raced, piecing together the implications. If the bike hadn't been in the river for long, then where had it been all these years? Back at the lab, forensic experts worked through the night to examine the bike, carefully disassembling it piece by piece. The rust, the wear on the tires, and the damage to the frame didn't match the timeline they had been working with. It was all too recent. It couldn't have been in the river for 6 years, as they had initially suspected. But then, one of the lab technicians made a chilling discovery. Inside the bike's compartment, hidden beneath a metal panel, was a map, folded, frayed at the edges, but still legible. It wasn't just any map. It was of a remote part of New Mexico. A small town, far off the beaten path. Reyes studied it intently, his brow furrowing as he traced the lines of the map with his fingers. There was a specific area marked, circled with a thick red ink. It was as if someone had wanted to make sure. That particular spot was never forgotten. He couldn't shake the feeling that the bike's owner had been hiding it, keeping it like a trophy, waiting for the right moment to let it be found. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. Francesca had been murdered, and her killer had kept the bike, hidden it for years, presumably as some twisted memento of what they had done. The weight of the discovery hung in the air as Reyes called in his team. We need to focus on this town, he said, his voice steady, but full of urgency. We need to know everything about it, everyone who's been there recently. The investigation had taken a dark turn, one that had now shifted its focus entirely. No longer was it just about finding Francesca. Now, it was about tracking down her killer, and the truth was beginning to unravel in a way that no one had expected. The search in New Mexico intensified. Reyes ordered his team to go through every record, every lead, every person who might have known something. He began to trace the connections between the area marked on the map and the strange man they had been tracking earlier, the man who had spoken to Francesca at the gas station. The pieces were beginning to align, but each connection was more disturbing than the last. Reyes knew that they were on the verge of something monumental. The killer had been in the shadows for far too long, and now, with every bit of evidence they uncovered, they were getting closer to the truth. But the truth came with its own cost. Every step forward only deepened the mystery and the danger. The chapter ended as Reyes stood alone in his office, looking out at the vast desert that stretched before him. The search was no longer just about finding Francesca. It was about justice. It was about making sure that her killer, the one who had been hiding in the dark for so long, would never be able to escape again. The intensity of the case was palpable. There were no more questions. Only answers that would lead them to the killer, and Reyes was determined to follow the trail wherever it led. The sun was setting over northern New Mexico, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The vast stretches of desert seemed endless, a quiet witness to the desperation that now gripped Detective Reyes and his team. Days had passed since the breakthrough, since they'd discovered the map hidden in Francesca's motorcycle. But now, as they combed through the small, isolated town, it felt like the world was closing in around them. The roads here were dusty, the air dry, and the people, well, the people were as indifferent as they were suspicious. Every face they encountered seemed to be hiding something. Every conversation felt like an interrogation, but no one had answers. The locals didn't care about Francesca. They didn't know her, and they didn't want to. Reyes walked slowly through an abandoned ranch, the wooden slats of the barn creaking as the wind whispered through them. The place was desolate. No animals, no crops, nothing but dust and decay. This was the kind of place people came to disappear, to hide. It felt like something out of a ghost story, but there was nothing supernatural about it. Only silence. The team had scoured the area for days, knocking on doors, asking questions, and getting nothing in return. Every lead they followed brought them back to a dead end. There was no sign of Francesca, no clue, no trail. Time was slipping through their fingers. "There's nothing here," one of the officers muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "We've checked every corner. We are not getting anything." Reyes didn't respond right away. He was lost in thought, staring out at the empty fields. He could feel the weight of the case pressing down on him, suffocating him. Every failure, every unanswered question, was a constant reminder of how far they were from finding the truth. The Sullivan family was just as lost, their grief gnawing at them from every direction. Mark and Eleanor, once so full of hope, were now shadows of their former selves. Each passing day without answers tore at them. They were helpless, unable to do anything but wait, to watch as the investigation they had clung to slipped further. Out of reach, back in their home, Eleanor sat by the phone, her hands shaking, waiting for a call that never came. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt anything but dread. Every day, she hoped the phone would ring, that someone would have the answers, but it didn't. There were no calls, no updates, just silence. Her eyes wandered over the pictures of Francesca on the wall, smiling, full of life. The daughter she had once known was now just a memory, a fading picture on the wall of a home that no longer felt like hers. And Mark, he had changed, too. His once steady demeanor had been shattered. His eyes were tired, haunted by the same questions that had kept him awake at night. He had spent countless hours reading over the case file, searching for something, anything, that could lead them to their daughter. But each time he picked it up, it felt heavier. The weight of the unknown had begun to crush him. They had come so far, yet still, they had nothing. The case was slipping through their fingers, and the world around them seemed to move on without them. But just as the case seemed doomed to stay unsolved, something unexpected happened. Reyes was at his desk, his mind racing, when the call came in. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an urgency behind it. "Detective Reyes, you're going to want to hear this." It didn't take long for Reyes to get to the Rio Grande Gorge. The place where Francesca's motorcycle had been found was only a small part of the mystery. It had always been about more, about finding her, about understanding what had happened to her, And now, something new had been found. As Reyes and his team arrived at the scene, they were met with a grim sight. A group of officers stood by the riverbank, their faces pale, eyes wide with shock. They had found something in the river, something that would change everything: human remains. The area where the remains were discovered wasn't far from where the motorcycle had been found. The bodies, partially submerged in the murky waters of the gorge, seemed to be buried in the earth, hidden in plain sight. The discovery hit like a shockwave, sending a ripple through the investigation that could be felt in every corner of the case. "Is it her?" Reyes asked, his voice tight with a mixture of dread and anticipation. "We don't know yet," the officer replied, shaking his head. "But we are pretty sure. The clothing, it's similar to what she was wearing in that last photo." Reyes felt his stomach drop. He didn't need confirmation. He could feel it in his bones. This was it. They had found something real, something tangible. The pieces were finally coming together, but at the same time, it only opened up more questions. How had the remains ended up here? Were they Francesca's? And if so, how had she died? As the team moved in to collect the remains, Reyes' mind raced. The mystery was far from over. But this discovery, this one horrifying breakthrough, would change everything. It would bring new life to a case that had nearly gone cold. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Reyes could feel the pressure mounting, the heat of the truth just out of reach. This discovery was a turning point, but it was also a beginning, a new chapter in a story that had already torn lives apart. For the Sullivan family, this moment would be both a revelation and a new nightmare. The case was about to go from missing person to homicide. The killer, whoever they were, was still out there. And Reyes knew that this was only the beginning of a much darker journey. The days had been dragging on, the weight of Francesca's disappearance pressing down on the Sullivan family with every passing hour. Mark and Eleanor had endured months of searching, clinging to whatever scraps of hope they could find, but the silence was deafening. The police were no closer to finding their daughter, and every call, every new piece of information, seemed to fall apart just as quickly as it appeared. And then came the call that I could feel the air leave my lungs when Detective Reyes spoke those words. "We've confirmed it. The remains found in the Rio Grande gorge belonged to Francesca." I was numb. The truth was too much to take in, too raw. The question I had been asking myself for months now had been answered, but it wasn't the answer I wanted. It wasn't the answer we'd been praying for. Her bones, fragments of her life, had been recovered from the very river where her motorcycle had been found. It was as if the world had finally given us the pieces, but only after breaking us first. The forensic experts worked quickly, confirming the identity of the remains through a unique bone fracture that matched Francesca's medical records. They didn't need to say it out loud. We all knew. It was her, and yet, even with the evidence, there was still a gnawing emptiness in my chest. The killer, the one who had taken our daughter from us, was still out there. And now, we knew what had happened. But not who had done it. Not why. Reyes paced in his office, his face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. He had come so far. The investigation had dragged on, piecing together evidence, following leads, trying to make sense of a crime that seemed almost too brutal to comprehend. That I could see the weight of the case on his shoulders. He had been chasing this shadow for months, just like us. But now, with the confirmation of Francesca's death, the final piece was within reach. Who did this? I asked, my voice tight, barely a whisper. Reyes shook his head, his jaw clenched. We don't know yet, but we are getting closer. But the truth was, the closer we got, the more questions there were. There was still a missing piece, a piece that felt like it was just out of reach. And as the days went by, the weight of it all only grew heavier. Mark and Eleanor weren't the same anymore. The pain was too much, too all-encompassing. Every corner of their lives was haunted by the absence of their daughter, and every new discovery, no matter how crucial, only deepened the void. They were shattered. I could see it in their eyes, in the way they looked at each other. The world, which had once seemed bright with hope, now felt distant, cold, and unforgiving. That I stood in the doorway of Reyes's office as he sifted through the case files. His eyes were bloodshot, but there was still fire in them, a flicker of resolve. He was close. I could feel it. We were all on the edge of something. But what? The phone rang, cutting through the silence like a knife. Reyes picked it up quickly, his expression hardening as he listened. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I didn't need to. The way Reyes's face shifted said everything. "What do you have?" I asked, barely able to breathe. Reyes held up a hand, signaling for me to wait as he listened intently. Then, finally, he spoke. "We've got a new lead. A connection to someone who might know more about Francesca's last days. This could break the case wide open." My heart raced. I couldn't believe it. After all this time, after all the dead ends, we were finally getting somewhere. Reyes didn't waste any time. He quickly made arrangements, his mind already working through the next steps. His fingers hovered over the phone as if they were ready to jump into action. I could sense the tension in the air, the raw energy of something about to happen. Something that could change everything, but as Reyes turned to leave, something stopped him. He hesitated for a moment, then looked back at me, his face a mix of resolve. "And we're not done yet," he said. "We are close, but we need to stay focused. The killer is still out there, and we need to make sure justice is served." I watched him walk out of the office, my thoughts spiraling. It felt like the world was about to tip over, and we were teetering on the edge. This lead, this new piece of the puzzle, was the hope we had been waiting for. But the truth was, we didn't know if it would be enough. Would it finally lead us to the person responsible for Francesca's death? Or was it just another dead end, another false hope? And as the days turned into nights, one question lingered in my mind, unrelenting. Would the killer remain at large, hidden in the shadows, or would justice finally catch up to them? The answers were just out of reach. But the hunt wasn't over. And neither was our fight. Uncertainty.